It's always these egomaniacs who rely on theatrics. If you have that in control of the US, that is a giant shift for the entire world. And you have a guy advocating for conflict with China. He's not directly saying that. Tucker Carlson is. That guy from The Rising Saagar, that cover, I don't know if you agree with this, but I don't like that show anymore because I think Krystal Ball isn't strong enough to deflect Saagar, and I think he overpowers her, and it ends up being Democratic, crapping on
Hmm.
Democrats fest. And it's like, oh, Trump, Republicans are sort of bad, but Saagar's like, yeah, still vote for Trump, and Crystal's like, don't vote for Biden. So that's just like handing the right electoral gains.
Hmm.
I don't know if you agree with
I
that, but yeah,
I was say I actually do still like the show in general. I agree with you that like it's not a progressive show, right?
yeah,
Um, I've always been someone actually who watches the news or reads things that I don't agree with more than I read things that I agree with, which is maybe just a weird personality quirk of mine. Like for the longest time, I was only ever subscribed to The Economist and to Foreign Affairs, The Economist being sort of right leaning, but I appreciated that they actually gave, like analysis and things like that. And it sort of spurred on my own criticisms in a certain way. So I, like I still watch the show, but I do agree with your criticisms of the show. I wouldn't say that I watch it all the time, but I watched I think like one episode this morning. But anyway, it's I'm a weird person, I guess.
yeah. And
Um,
I go through different content consumption periods, like of opinions that I want to hear at the time and that I think are valuable at the time. Like I started watching a little bit of Tim Pool to see what that was all about because I know he calls himself a liberal, but he just
he's
talks like he's falling off the right side of the political grid. But he calls himself an old lefty. I'm like, what about you? Like, about you is
he says he's
lefty?
voting for Trump, right?
Yeah. The only lefty thing he said is I hate corporations, but that's what fascists say. I mean, they say that. Just hating corporations doesn't mean you're on the left. It
Yeah,
means
that
you're
okay, actually
populist.
we should clarify that right now actually, cuz early fascism, especially with Mussolini, you know, initially it wasn't actually all that clear whether or not he was going to be on the left or on the right. In fact, because he allied with a lot of people who were on the left. Now, nowadays, I will say the left has learned their lesson because they got burned so bad in World War II with sort of fascist rhetoric, and it was much more new at the time because it isn't it isn't sort of 20th or I should say 18th century liberalism or 19th century liberalism or the conservatism of Burke. It's a very distinct, very different ideology than conservatism or liberalism. And so the left really was burned under Mussolini. So we have learned our lesson. But Mussolini was able to attract a lot of leftists, and it wasn't until like I think almost like 8 years after he was in power that things really started turning down the bad end. I mean, we started seeing instances of it just a few years after he got into power, but it wasn't immediate. It was not immediate. um, and so I think that that is an important lesson to remember, which is that there are in fascist trends the tendency to talk about the dangers of big business, the dangers to talk about the dangers of corporations. But then at the end of the day, they're much, much more happy to crush socialists than to try to actually crush the corporation. And they're
Yeah.
much more happy to break unions than they are to break racists, right? So and also the terrifying thing about that was also that even conservatives who would disagree with fascists in terms of rhetoric would oftentimes find socialists worse than fascists, and so would ally with the fascists. And at least this is in the case of Italy. There was a little bit of difference when it came to Nazi Germany. The breakdown was slightly different, where there were more leftists who initially opposed it, possibly because of the lessons that were going on in Italy. But anyway, we don't need to go too deep in sort of the historical nuances of it. But yeah, guys, like we do need to pay attention to that kind of stuff. There are people on the right historically and even today who will oppose corporations, who will say all the right things about being anti-tech, anti-big business, or I shouldn't say anti-tech, but no one's I suppose like truly anti-tech besides the sort of Luddites, but anti-big tech, right? They'll say all those right things, but then when you really break it down, they're much more interested in law and order. They're much more interested in crushing unions. They're worried about unions promoting disorder and undermining the principle of private property. These are the kinds of things that will tell you, hold on, these people aren't really with you. And we do have to pay, I think, very close attention to those kinds of things because, again, it does happen on the right.
Yeah. And if you look at Mussolini's original platform, it included workers' rights, it included healthcare, I think. Even Hitler's. Like they always start with this idea of like we're all encompassing, we're just fighting for populism. Just like I used to do, I stopped doing this, but I would get a Tucker Carlson clip and make a video out of it. Like, hey, look, he's saying something good about Bernie, but he's not saying anything good about Bernie. And I think what you said about people being confused who their actual enemies are, basically what you said about different people in that time period. I think we're getting that today a little bit because I see a lot more focus from left circles on attacking neoliberals than I do with attacking fascism. And I see a lot more agreements with people that are on the far right
Mm.
because there is that disdain of corporations. But, the thing I don't like about the show Rising is they agree on the problems. But if they actually say anything about solutions, then Crystal Ball will say we need universal health care. Saagar will say we need to bomb China. Or if you talk to a lot of people, we might say we need to make sure there's a more equitable system of immigration to protect workers' rights, to make sure we don't have people coming in making slavery wages to undercut American workers. While someone on the right will say, you're right, we need to make an ethno state. Or like, they don't actually say that. But the solutions to get to the ends that we're both like searching for, I think it kind of confuses people on the left because we're like, yeah, we agree with that. We agree Bernie's getting screwed over by corporations and corporations suck. But they'll be the first ones to take over corporations, to take over the government, and we'll be the first ones that they silence if they get the chance. Like the first political prisoners in a concentration camp in history. Um, I mean, obviously for the world wars was socialists and communists and Democrats in Hitler's
Hmm.
Germany. Those were the first people put in the concentration camps. Like I feel like they're co-opting our disdain for the system and saying, "Yeah, we agree with you," but they're sort of like walking us into a path that hurts us too.
Yeah, we do need to be really careful about sort of who I don't I even almost want to hesitate on terms of enemies because it's not that black and white. It's not that Manichaean.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
it is an open dialogue, and there very well be very minor things that you can work with, even people who you completely disagree with on for certain kinds of things, right? But it requires being careful. It requires not being tricked, right? It requires actively, I think, trying to learn about other people. And I think that that's where things start to get messy and start to get tricky. You actually do, in order to not get tricked, you actually have to learn about other ideologies. You actually do have to read into possibly fascist writings at the time of sort of Mussolini. Like, if you don't understand fascism, then you're going to get tricked by fascism. That's the point I want to make. I'm not saying like go read fascist literature and then go enjoy it, but if you don't have if you don't have any idea what fascists argued for in the past, then it's going to come around again and you're going to get confused, just like a bunch of socialists did in Mussolini's Italy. Like so you do have to be absolutely careful, and you do have to be willing to watch and listen to people who you disagree with in order to make sure that you don't get tricked. People think that, well, if you watch something or you listen to something that you disagree with, then that means that you're gonna get tricked. No, that's actually how you avoid getting tricked. I mean, it requires critical thinking and it requires active engagement. Um, but if we can't ask that of people, then I'm not sure that we can ask for the future of this species, right? Like, that seems like the bare minimum. Then we're gonna fail when it comes to climate change. We're gonna fail when it comes to avoiding nuclear war if we can't ask critical thinking of people. I don't know. I mean, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. But I think that at least starting down that path of critical thinking is I think a safe bet.